Thanks for being here. So again, I'm Dr. Amber Banks, and I'm joined by Dr. Tamika Mcglond. And we would love, as we get started, if you could please share your name, your preferred gender pronouns, your organization, and then we're going to be talking about trust today. And so invite in whoever your mentors, guides, ancestors, the folks who have taught you about trust and connection. We'd love for you to share that as well. So please pop that into the chat when you have a moment. So the goals for today's session, we hope that you feel increased trust with yourself. Self-trust is a really important part of this, and with one another. And we hope to really talk through an expanded definition of trust and a toolkit for expanding trust in racial justice work specifically. I want to share that again, I mentioned a few technical difficulties. We had a format for today that would have that was going to enable some discussion, and instead we're going to do a Q&A towards the end. So hope that everyone can just flow with us and appreciate your grace as we navigate just a couple shifts in the session today. Thanks to everyone who is posting in the chat. Great. I just got word that everyone can speak, and so we may be able to do our discussion after all. So we'll keep you posted as we go. We're going to dive in, though, in the interest of time. So wonderful to see all the amazing folks who are here with us today and the folks who you're calling in. It's really beautiful. Thank you. I'm coming. Thank you. So the goal for today is we hope you leave this session with a sense of expanded possibilities around trust. So quickly, I am Amber Banks. I'm the founder and CEO of the Center for Trust and Transformation. We are focused on advancing trust as a building block for racial and social justice. I'm joined today by Dr. Tamika Mcglond. Tamika, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so humbled by being in your presence and very grateful for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Tamika Mcglond. I'm based at UC Berkeley, and I am calling in my ancestors as a fourth generation educator, those who came before me. And I will name my grandmother, Unita Mcglond, who was a long-standing 52-year-long teacher in the Rosenwald schools in the South. And so very grateful to be here. Please keep adding to the chat, and we're going to make the best of this technical experience and gift as we can.
Thank you, Tamika. I'm calling in my beautiful niece who passed away a couple of years ago. Her name is Shakira Brooks, and she modeled for me what self-trust looks like. So really grateful to have you all and the folks you've called in today. We're gonna start with just a few grounding agreements. Dr. Mcglond?
Yes, yes. And just being mindful that we're in this virtual space together, we're going to do our best to make it feel like we're right next to one another, creating intimacy, connection, and nurturing just your very presence that we honor as a gift. And so I'll just walk really briefly through some grounding agreements so that we can come in this with some synergistic alignment about how to share this space with one another. Be present, cameras on. We really wish we could see you all. Unfortunately, we can't, but we know you all can see each other. So make sure you stay with us on that one. Assume good intentions, live into that, listen for understanding, step up, step back. It looks like we are able to have the discussion. So we're inviting that dynamic in. Be rigorous with ideas and gentle with each other. I've been a fan of talking about gentleness and tenderness lately. So we're inviting you into that dynamic. Use the emojis to indicate agreement. We want you to max out on all the features within this virtual space. and engage. Come off mute where feasible. If we're able to hear you, we really welcome you into the space. Still, hopefully, we'll get through the technical challenges, and the session will be recorded for reference, for future reference. And so, because I want your consent, I will invite you all to offer a thumbs up if you all are in consent and in consensual agreement around the grounding agreements.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Now that we've got all the housekeeping out of the way, we're going to dive in. Thank you for being here. So the goal of today is to talk through shifting narratives around trust. So trust is a concept that we are all familiar with. It shapes our lives in our personal relationships, in our work. And one of the things that brings me to this work is really an interrogation of our current definitions and narratives around trust. So when I started this work about a decade ago, I dug into the research and narratives around trust and found some pretty significant limitations. And the idea here is that we're building on what prior folks have brought to the forefront. So the goal here isn't to say the current definitions of trust are wrong. It's that they're missing some key components. And so one of those components is that our current definitions of trust are characteristic based. And so this means that we focus on things like integrity and competence in our definitions of trust. And the idea is that those things aren't wrong, but that how we arrive at in our definitions of integrity or what's meaningful in a given context around competence or honesty is culturally and contextually constructed, which means that we don't necessarily all have the same definition. A second component is that trust is role-centric. And so a lot of times we talk about trust between managers and employees or teachers and principals, when we know that people have multiple identities that they bring to any given context. Another piece is that we talk about trust often in a way where it's fixed and one-dimensional. So I often say that trust isn't like a light switch that turns off and on, right? And a lot of times when trust is absent, we talk about it as though it is absent in perpetuity, right? Or that the fluidity of trust. So another example is, you may trust someone in one context, but not another. Speaking of context, so we often miss how the dynamics of trust are different across these different geographical or partnership contexts. So different relationships inform and different contexts inform how we build and repair trust. Sociopolitical factors, so race, power, status, gender, these other factors that define who we are not necessarily sufficiently considered in how we construct our definitions of trust. And we're going to dig more into this in a bit. And then lastly, the predominant narratives and defining work around trust has been done by primarily white male people. And so we have limited mainstream narratives from Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color on how we define trust. And this is perhaps one of the most important pieces of this. And so what this adds up to is some problematic narratives about trust. So one of them is that diversity is bad for trust. And we've seen this through a variety of different thinkers over time. And indeed, there's some research that shows that there's this term homophily, that we are attracted to people who are like us. That is true. And we also do build trust across differences. And so the idea here is to expand the narrative to include both the concept of likeness and finding commonality across differences. Another narrative is that trust can often be a nice to have, but it's not required. And so folks will often move through processes or engagements, partnerships, and collaborations in acknowledgement that trust is low. However, it doesn't always stop the process to stop and build trust. And there's often a lot of urgency for good reason around issues of racial and social justice. However, most of the research and my own personal opinion is that we cannot be successful in those endeavors without the foundation of trust. The final piece is just because of the way that our definitions of trust have been constructed, there's a narrative that my definition of trust is the same as your definition of trust. And that trust, again, is this universal concept, or the pieces underneath it are universal for everyone. So this is what we want to call into question. So the paradigm shift that we're calling for here is acknowledging the role of race, culture, and power on trust, and acknowledging that trust is shaped by these dynamics. I'm gonna share a quick example, but this one is really big. And there's been some work that's been done around racialized trust, politicized trust. We know that race and power and culture and gender play a role in how we construct and how we navigate our relationships. However, we haven't necessarily sufficiently created room for conversations around this. Another piece is that trust without action and action without trust can be equally detrimental. So this is work that was confirmed through some of my earlier research, and there's some other resources out there, that there's this delicate balance between taking action and building trust. And so a lot of times we'll spend time building trust, and that is very important. And then there's a point that organically emerges in groups that I would love to more technically define at some point, but there's a point when a group is ready to move. And staying in the trust building space without moving to action can often raise distrust. Conversely, taking action without trust in place can often lead to patterns of dysfunction, mistrust, lack of communication, and many of the other features that we all have become familiar with. And finally, that how we experience and engage in our relationships is based on our identities, our values, our context, how we're positioned within our organizations, and that all of these factors are coming together to inform our relationships. So the goal is not to have the same definition of trust, but to understand each other's definitions of trust so that the actions that we take, the words that we share, have meaning for ourselves and for each other. So I'm just going to share a quick example. So this picture here is a picture of Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. Some of you may be familiar with a story that was in the news recently around some trust building work that they have done with some of the Native communities in that region. So Fort Lewis College is on the ancestral lands of the Ute tribe, and connected to the ceremonial and communal spaces of the Apache, Hopi, and Navajo nations. The college was formerly the site of the Fort Lewis Indian School that was closed in 1910. So this exact site was formerly an Indian school. And when it was closed, they reopened as Fort Lewis College. The college's clock tower, which you see in this picture here, had three or four plaques commemorating the Indian school, which was the site of terrible atrocities against Native American families in the region. And the commemoration of the existence of this institution in the community was deeply traumatizing. And so the college, under the current president, Tom Stridicus, held a series of conversations with Native leaders, elders, students. The college actually serves 45% of the student population are identify as Native students, they held a series of conversations about the plaque and of these plaques and what they meant. And the students shared that they were offensive and they lobbied for their removal. So earlier in September, the plaques were removed during a healing ceremony that was led by a group of local Native leaders. And there's a process underway to replace the panels in the clock tower that's being led by Native students, staff, and elders. And so this story illustrates that it's about the process, not the outcome, and that the process and the dialogue facilitated healing and created space for multiple truths. What held meaning for the region's Native tribes was what is at the center of this process. So we want to talk about trust as culturally and contextually rooted. So when we think about how we arrive to this work, 4 questions to take away in your context is, what does it feel like to be seen in our relationships with one another? And that's how our identities show up. What becomes possible when your values are honored? What does radical trust and repair look like in your current context? And what does liberation and deep connection require? And as we think about these components, I think it's both personal reflection in how we identify with each of these 4 components, but also what they mean in terms of the work that we're doing together. So this is a mural in San Francisco called From Incarceration to Liberation by Juana Alicia. And it's the project is entitled The Creative Process of Prison Abolition, a mural for San Francisco State University's Project Rebound, designed and painted by the True Colors Mural Project of Berkeley City College. And what I love about this mural is so many things, but the imagination. And the goal is to create spaces for us to dream together about what's possible beyond the current paradigm. We are the future of trust. And as we think about how we want to show up in our relationships and the dimensions of trust that we want to bring into our partnerships and collaborations, the invitation is to bring our full selves and create spaces for what this means for us. Oh, thank you, Georgine. I love that you're a SFSU grad student. That's a wonderful connection. Thank you for sharing. So we would like to invite dialogue. I'm not 100% sure how many people are here, somewhere in the 40s at last check. But we would like to invite some dialogue. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Mcglond, to lead us in a conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Banks. And I know that that was a tremendous amount of information related to the dimensions of trust, and covered a number of the ways in which we've been thinking about trust and liberation. And dare I use one of the quotes we've been playing with, how do you surface the pain when trust has ruptured and land in the joy and transformation of it? And so as a reflective moment, we invite you to just take a moment and think about yourself and your own work, and think about this idea of advancing equity, when you are also navigating the dimensions of trust and the impact when there's been harm, or trauma, or something that has occurred that undermines your very being. inside of relationship with others. It could be family, community, in the workspace, writ large. Our world is feeling a range of different dimensions of what I define as suffering. And so as you start to think about what does repair beyond an apology look like in your wildest dreams, we want to give you a moment to just contemplate that reflective question. What does repair beyond an apology look like in your wildest dreams? So I really am a fan of a reflective practice. And so we invite you to just take, I'm going to time you a minute just to reflect on this question, and then we'll invite you to share. I'll call it a catalytic minute of reflection. And another 10 seconds. All right. So please, we invite your voices into the space. What came up for you? What are some of your thoughts? What does that repair look like? Yes, thank you, Kelly.
There's so much vulnerability and trust. I appreciate you naming that, Kelly.
And even that was vulnerable and courageous to offer it even in this space, Kelly. So thank you. Yes, Paula, following through with positive actions that are sustained over time. Kimberly, getting in the dirt and building with me. Beautiful. Shavashe, looks like a heal space, opportunity, inclusion. Yes. Keep them coming. Haley, understanding and respect. Your wildest dreams. Keep them coming.
Tamika, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
One of the reasons we wanted to invite this question is because we're seeing a lot of apology right now in many spaces. And I think we want to think beyond that, right? And not to discredit the role of apology. Apology is very important, but we talk about acknowledgement, accountability, and action, right? And what does it look like to go beyond just the apology?
In the healing work inside of what it takes to meet each other in a place of that vulnerability, with transparency and honesty. I saw words like inclusion, Jane saying invitation to co-creation, Aaron's offering this idea of changed behavior. Absolutely. Taking ownership of the change rather than hoping for the change. Fostering a way to be together. A seat at the table. It's powerful.
I'm curious if anyone wants to come in with bring more voices into the space. I know we're at on the first day of the conference, but I'm loving the chat and would love to hear if anyone wants to bring their voice in.
Hi, this is Rhonda Mauer. I'm happy to speak up. So can you guys hear me?
Yes, Rhonda. Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak and for this wonderful presentation. And so I said acknowledgement, honoring contributions in the face of barriers, adequate resources, and shared accountability. And just to give a little bit of background, you know, this is, so I work for predominantly, white organization that is, fairly new on our, I mean, we're not new, I think about 6 years into our DEI journey and work. And, in doing this work, what we found is across the board, I mean, no matter what you look like, who you are, there are some gut punches that happen along the way. And, being able to openly acknowledge, those gut punches and then, honor the contributions of the people that face those barriers and deal with those gut punches and continue on in spite of it. And then, the acknowledgement that there's shared accountability and creating an environment, a culture that is, a shared accountability that creates a culture that works for all of us. I think we're getting there. We're making huge strides. And I think in order for us to really be, successful long-term, adequate resources are necessary. So those are my thoughts. And to me, that's what repair beyond apology looks like. Acknowledging everything that I just said and actually committing to action beyond words.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And Rhonda, you named so many different dimensions inside of what it takes to get there. Would you be willing to offer, what have you experienced that you have felt proved beneficial inside of the spaces that you've been in?
So I just learned the language for this, but honestly, what's been the most beneficial is calling people in instead of calling them out. So when those gut punches happen, so I attended the Othering and Belonging Institute's sessions yesterday and the day before.
Yes.
And they talked a lot about calling in. And I have to tell you, it's like it's one of the hardest things that I've had to do and had to learn how to do. And but it's transformative
Mm-hmm.
when and modeling that behavior for folks encourages more of it, so I put myself out there on a regular basis and call people in, and I do it in public. I do it publicly. And then I also acknowledge the like the co-creation of this, like that we're all responsible for creating a world of greater justice and hope at our organization for each other.
Yeah.
And then acknowledging the successes and calling people out by name. That's when I do call people out by name when the successes happen.
Right.
And it's helped a lot.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rhonda. And can I just tell you, it's so affirming to hear you speak on naming the calling in. And as you know, having attended the Othering and Belonging Institute, that conference and their summit, you just named really at the heart of what I think John Powell and Bell Hooks meant when they were forming this idea of what does it mean to belong, even when harm, distrust, trauma, oppression, all the things that make the idea of calling in a very, very difficult thing to do, as you said, which requires trusting yourself and knowing that from within, that the transformative work happens from the way you model exactly what you just so beautifully described. So thank you for living into what does it mean to shift that narrative and offer a counter narrative to this idea of like the calling out, that is the negative type, versus the calling in, which really is the catalyst for the healing work, the transformational work, the trust work, the change work, and then naming and honoring those who are able to do that work with you in that rhythm of change. Thank you. All right, anyone else want to share? We just really want to open up the space and hear your voices. Please come in and share. We have
Tamika,
time and space for a few more.
There was a question about what calling in looks like.
Ooh, I love that question. Rhonda, come back on and give it to us.
I thought I'm muted, I think. Can you hear me?
You're back. Teamwork makes the dream work, Rhonda. Come on.
So I'll give you a perfect example. So when, and I remember this because it was painful. So like 3 years ago, when I first got promoted into the role leading DE&I for our national organization, I think a lot of people were in pain and a lot of voices were not being heard. A lot of women, BIPOC individuals just were angry. And I get it, I understood. And so we opened up the dialogue and invited people to tell us, what their thoughts were as we started doing programming. So we started doing training and education and so on and so forth. And there was this one individual in particular who was brilliant, absolutely brilliant and wonderful young woman who just every single presentation, webinar, training session we had, it was like a WWF body slam every time, or a verbal body slam every time. And we just couldn't do anything right, and it was never enough. And it was shaming for me. It was like very public, the way she handled it. And so she was calling me out on a regular basis. And so what I finally started doing was, there's this thing about, I was like, she obviously needs to be heard. She doesn't feel heard. And I'm not perfect. I know we can change. And so I started asking her, for more feedback. And I started asking her, for more direct feedback. Like, so help me understand where we went wrong. Help me understand, what we could do differently. What are your thoughts about X? And I did that often. And then when we started our learning, we have a DE&I strategy team that we were revamping and asking new members to join. I asked her to join. And I said, will you help us in our next phase of co-creating our culture together? Now, I want to tell you, people run from this woman because they're afraid of her, And this was one of the few times in our organization where she was asked to participate. And not only participate, like really tell us, don't hold back. Let's make this change together. You're a part of it. And as a result, I think our programming and our actions, not just our programming, but our actions have improved. Actually, I know they have because of her input.
Well, thank you for that explicit example, Rhonda. And I know that personality you're referring to. And I think, and it was a great question, Paula, that idea of the calling in, I think invites everyone to be a part of a process of humanity, humanizing, and then humility. There's so many different dimensions inside of what Rhonda described in response to Paula's question, and just even being in a place of work where you have someone who others fear. And we know fear can be so destructive on so many different levels when there is no space to name that fear, or to the other point, I think Jill was basically saying, if it's not a safe space to express whether or not the reparative action can occur. And then do you have people in those spaces who actually can create safe spaces and brave spaces to invite people into that kind of process of repair? And we, I'm sure many of you have heard hurt people hurt people. And so then when you're thinking about it, the way Rhonda was characterizing like a different approach was to invite her in and to welcome her into a process that sounded as though everyone was willing to create a space to humanize her, find their own humility to start to establish what could be trusting actions with her, and then naming some things where the work together could come inside of that space of that collective healing work. It's like the individual and the collective work can occur inside of those spaces of repair. Dr. Amber, anything to add?
No, I love it. I really appreciate the calling in example. And I think, just going back to the point on courage, I think in the opening session that Uma shared, and it does take a lot of courage to lean into those conversations, because there is a lot of harm that we carry into those conversations, and those conversations can inflict harm in and of themselves. And so in seeking the healing, right, we often navigate those risks as well. So just really appreciate the example.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge Devin's comment about we can't get equity without achieving that, like this idea of acknowledging everyone's humanity. So I think Rhonda presented a wonderful example and speaks to what I think is flowing throughout the continuity of the contributions showing up in the chat. Is there has to be an invitation inside of the invitation, which starts with self, right? And then it becomes part of the process and that cascading effect when we go within that work with others.
Hi, my name, I have something. My name is Amni Talib. I came in late on the conversation, But just for looking at the question here, what does repair beyond apology look like? I mean, sometimes when we, even in a simpler example, when you upset someone and you want to apologize them on a very softer level, you just say you're sorry and then say, I think I could do this. I think I could do this. You start assuming what it is that you want to do for that person. I think the repair should be inviting that person, saying, what is it that I can do to make you feel better? What is it that I can do to take the hurt away, or to I don't know if I'm expressing it right, but this is what I'm getting. Like, we're always looking at what's going to work for us that we think is going to be good for them. But you really have to find out what is going to work for them. Talk to them, communicate, and make sure you understand in what way you hurt them, or in what way, what kind of damage was done and how that damage can be repaired, rather than you trying to say, well, if I do this, it should be okay. And if I do this, it should be good. No, you have to really open the lines of communication. Say, what is it that you're looking for? And if you know what it is that they're looking for because of communication you've had, that's what you should do to repair it.
Ashe and amen, and so it is. That is agreed upon. And I think that you're naming what is another, I think, counterpoint to something that Dr. Banks mentioned earlier inside of like culture. Oftentimes the cultures that we've created don't create space for that level of inquiry. Or being willing to be uncomfortable to say, I don't know how my apology will make the situation better. Will you tell me? And I once upon a time, nearly almost 30 years ago, my first job was I was a math and science tutor at an elementary school. I know I don't look that young. Or that season or vintage, either way you want to frame it. But working with children, one of the things that we often talked about was the 4-part apology. You apologize, you name what it was for, you ask, is there anything I can do for you? And then you let them know you will do your best not to let it happen again. That 4-part apology to me is like a baseline. And so that has to be practiced. And so this idea of us inviting you into beyond your wildest dreams, it does include everything you just named about being able to humble oneself to say, what is it that I can do for you? And be willing to hear whatever it may be, and then translate that into the action that can come from that effort. All right, any other thoughts, questions, naming of things? I see Scotty. Scotty, are you going to speak to us? You want to bring your voice into the room?
Sure. Although I was very much appreciating what Rhonda Mauer was saying, and thinking back to the first session when Gail Christopher and John A. Powell were being awarded. And I believe the question was asked because we see so much, like even today, of our interactions are happening in these virtual spaces. And I find it very difficult to figure out, how do we make those safe spaces, and how do we come together in a way that can distance us from each other, even when we want it to bring ourselves together, to create safe spaces, to call people in, to hold up successes. About the time the 2016 campaign was getting underway, I made a promise to myself that I wasn't going to call anybody a name because I think that is just so harmful. And so for me, that's just one way of trying to create safer spaces when I'm interacting with people in social media or virtual settings. So I appreciate this conversation and all that you all are bringing to it. I also want to say that I was calling on my daughters at the start. And as I was sitting here, my daughter, who lives in Colorado and is on fall break, she's a first grade teacher, was at Fort Lewis College, and she was like, hey, Mom. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I called on my daughter and she's where you're talking about. Dr. Banks was talking about the Fort Lewis College Tower and learning about that at the same time. So anyway, the world is a powerful, powerful place.
Indeed, it is, Scotty. I'd call it, using Deepak Chopra's word, synchrodestiny, to have that happen. And thank you for your wise insights and shared perspectives. That's spot on, spot on. Thank you. And as we transition to just opening up the Q&A, are there any other questions, thoughts that are coming up for you all that Dr. Banks or myself can answer related to what's been shared so far, the way in which we've been exploring the examples. Thank you, Rhonda, for bringing much of your voice and experience and your wisdom to the space. About the artwork, any of the examples, those current definitions of trust that are often used, and then the expanded ones that were offered by Dr. Banks.
I'm not sure if you can see, I have my hand raised. Do you mind if I jump on in?
Yes, please do
Okay.
so. Thank you.
My name is Ellen Ray. I'm in Chicago. And I was reminded as you were talking of when Mariame Kaba talks about hope as a discipline, that it feels very much like repair and restoration and trust building are disciplines too. And the way that you've talked about it being process and requiring reflection and humility, I would just love to hear your perspective on what are the disciplines when we think about trust building that are really important to sustain it, if it truly is the process and not just the outcome.
Love that question. Thank you, Ellen. I think the first discipline is care. And I think it comes down to truly caring about each other and connecting, as was talked about in the opening plenary, to each other's humanity. I think Dr. Gail Christopher spoke to it so eloquently. Because if you care about someone, then you want the repair to be meaningful, right? And even if the connection is not what you hope it will be, at least you can be on a path towards healing. And so I do think that care, and it's hard because we are navigating around institutions that are disconnecting by nature. And so it's almost like the intentional care and seeing of each other as a radical act and the first step. Dr. Mcglond, what else would you add?
I would add compassion. I love the follower heuristic. So I'll just say compassion. To add to that care, I think that there's something about the practice of radical compassion. And Elder Alice Walker does a beautiful job in many of her writings talking about this idea of like compassion with, of course, a range of Buddhist teachings, but this idea of tapping into one's humanity from within to source the effort of humility as the action and the practice. And that compassion actually can become, very much like to your point, Ellen, a discipline, a practice that requires intentional, deliberate self-awareness and self-reflection that leads to the practice of care, as well as compassion. It takes a tremendous amount of what I would define as surrender to humble oneself and to like do the work of building trust, first with self as well as with others. And I think radical compassion as a discipline is another element that I would add to care.
Thank you.
Can I just put a point on something you just said, Dr. Mcglond, which is SelfTrust. So I came to this work looking at trust through various different lenses, right? And one of the things that has really struck me is that how we relate to ourselves has so much to do with how we relate to others, right? Like we are kind of the first layer of all of those interactions. And I don't have the answer by any stretch of the imagination, but just to underscore that really cultivating trust with yourself and trusting yourself is a really, I think, underestimated component of how we build trust with others.
Yeah, and it was such a great question, Ellen. All these questions are wonderful, but you're naming something that I'll just add one more C to, and I'd say that would be consistency. And just like with going to the gym, you know, in terms of building your muscles, you have to go, if that's your thing, to work out to build that muscle. And when you're consistent about the practice of care and compassion, it then becomes part of the discipline that one can practice inside of those spaces. But it does all start with self. And there is something about being able to be inside of spaces that are fracturing, dishonoring, disrespectful, harmful, where very few spaces create opportunities for reparative work. And so it becomes really important to assess, okay, where are the places where I can be with others who are in alignment around these ideals of like care and compassion and being consistent within that practice. And then thinking about like self-to-system agency. How do you nurture your own agency of self-care, self-awareness, and self-reflection, recognizing that oftentimes we have not spent time in places, institutions, organizations, businesses, et cetera, that foster these types of dynamics. And oftentimes people are saying, oh, well, that's the social emotional learning. That's kind of like the latest languaging people bring to it. And I dare I say, it is not the critical analysis of what does it take to do the reparative work. So I'll stop there, but consistency of practice, especially inside of reflection and self-trust.
This is Erin. I had a thought and question. One, Dr. Banks, I so appreciate you for coming back to that trust of self, because I thought, ooh, let's not blow past that. But also just, and I said this in the chat, it's really hard for me to talk about repair and not think about reparations, and really think about the ways in which reparations has happened in some places and with some people groups. And it is something that continues to be slow walked, denied to the Black community. And so it just has me thinking about, and I wonder you all's thoughts, because it feels like some of this conversation is about repair at an interpersonal level. So how do we situate or think about interpersonal repair versus institutional or structural repair? So yeah, would just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you for bringing reparations into the conversation, Erin. I really appreciate it. You're absolutely right. Reparations are critical for institutional repair. And again, I kind of go back to this like acknowledgement, accountability, and action, right? Like reparations have we have to acknowledge that the harm was done and continues to be done every single day. And I think I like to think expansively about reparations. So monetary reparations are one, right? When you look at the statistics around income and housing ownership after red line laws and all of the various ways in which economic success has been and access has been systemically denied to Black Americans is appalling, and monetary reparations are really important. I've been thinking a lot about recently about time reparations, right? Like, I know it's a big concept, but you know, we have time is something that you can never get back. And what does that mean for us in our communities? And what does it look like for us to envision policies and systems that honor and create space for our time and well-being? And so I just really appreciate you bringing that in and invite us to think as expansively as possible about the different types of reparations that would truly allow us to feel seen and honored and would be meaningful forms of repair. Dr. Mcglond, what would you add?
I think you nailed it. And Aaron, you're surfacing and really excavating a question that I think lends itself to that power dimension. When you talk about structural and institutional reparations, how does that occur? You know, I know for me, I am often in a lot of spaces where there's power. I don't know too many folks with power who wake up and who are like, oh, I'm ready to relinquish my power. In those structural and institutional dimensions that I think benefit by those individuals who maintain in those structures, in those institutions, a way of being. And so I think that you are bringing into the center, into the nexus of what Dr. Banks was referencing, is like, how do we think about the full scale spectrum of reparations, and where are the places that we need to continue to explore and interrogate, even in this work we're doing, to ask those questions, because I think that there is something about, like I was speaking about the self-to-system agency, there's something about the structural and the institutional dimensions of reparations that are inextricably linked to power and those who want to maintain that power. And don't believe in reparations and have no interest in reparations, and actually don't even think that reparations are owed or due to anyone, especially Black folks. And so I love that you brought that question into the space, and it's one that we don't have a final answer to. It's one that we are living in the questions about.
Can I say something about, like, I'm so glad reparations came up. Do we still have time? I don't even know what time it is.
We do, Kimberly. Get it in. We'll make it quick.
Okay. Just drop it. Okay. So as I am of Caribbean descent, and I tell folks I'm learning about African American culture kind of as a third party. I look African American, people don't know it, but my experience is different. And what I've learned as I'm learning about reparations and what it is, but going back to a human standpoint, I think about, in my practice and my awakening of being a human, I recognize that there was a practice of being able to receive that we don't have. So when the reparations come, what are we going to do with it if we're not healed, open to receive what it is? So I do believe all of what externally needs to happen, I believe it will happen. I believe it took generations for us to get here. I don't know when it's coming, but what I can do, what I have the power to do, is start my healing and affect change generationally of healing, so that when it comes, I'm already good to receive. Hey, let's do it.
Amen.
Amen. Hallelujah. And so it is. Kimberly Nicole Smith, you just dropped the mic right where it needed to land. Thank you. And there is something about receiving that is even a process of unlearning for those who have historically not been afforded the space to simply be. And so this idea of, when the reparations come, how do we create space to be ready for the receiving of? And as we come full circle, we want to extend our deepest gratitude to you, to all of you all who shared your thoughts, whether through chat or in voice, in your presence. Your divine presence was a gift to us, and we hope it was for each other in this process. Go back to that reflective thought, please, really quickly, and we're gonna leave you with this. Adrienne Maree Brown, to make more possible, deepen the trust. I just wanted to say that to you all. And as you all leave us, we are expecting you to be ambassadors of trust and healing and the beacons of light that you are and have been for this session. We want to thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Upswell for allowing us to have this space to share with you around this idea of shifting the paradigm of the narrative related to trust and liberation. Dr. Banks, close us out.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Mcglond. We so appreciate your engagement and rich contributions to this discussion. We look forward to seeing you over the next couple days and being in community with you all, hopefully moving forward. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.